Back at the '05 reveal, GGG did their usual Q&A, and like always, balance and game direction questions come up, same as every reveal, but this time Jonathan and Mark actually went deep on some stuff. Real systems, real numbers, actual reasoning, not just the usual surface level stuff. That was over 2 months back now, so I went back and checked every single one of these issues against where the game's actually at today in 05.4. Some of it's already fixed, some of it is still broken, and just to confirm, this is not a video about what's wrong with this game. It's about how a studio actually figures out what to fix while providing a live service game. If you've ever wondered why defenses feel inconsistent, why Leech feels off, or why life still isn't on the tree, the actual answers are way more interesting than you think. Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Sammy. Let's get to it. All right, let's start with the one Jonathan himself called his own Giga rant during the Q&A. So you know it's a real one that's bothering them. And I'm referring to the defense problem in the game. GGG actually went and looked at real player statistics, not impressions, actual data on how much defense the average player has at different points in the game. And what they found surprised them. Players are sitting on meaningfully less defense than the game was actually balanced around, especially from around Act 4 through early endgame. Jonathan was upfront that this isn't really about players making bad choices, it's that the system's meant to get people there. Passive tree nodes, armor formulas just aren't pulling their weight. He specifically called out armor as having, in his words, a missing piece of the puzzle that he doesn't have a full solution for yet. A real, honest admission of an unsolved problem, not a deflection. Here's the part worth actually giving them credit for, though. This wasn't just talk. GGG confirmed they were already buffing defensive base types across armor and evasion gear all the way up through endgame as part of 05 itself, not saved for some future patch. So this is a case where they identified a real problem using their own data and then actually shipped a response to it in the same breath. We are living those armor buffs in the current patch. But this problem isn't new, and it isn't just me reading tea leaves off of the Q&A either. Kaparian, and if you don't know him, generally one of the smartest, most technical PoE minds out there, called this out in real detail all the way back in December 2024. Basically the very first version of this game. His breakdown was blunt. Armor's diminishing returns formula means it's only really shines against small hits, but against the actual big hits that one-shot you in high-level content. Armor barely helps at all, even fully invested. His actual recommendation at the time, and I mean this stuck with me, Cloak of Flame converting physical damage to fire cost him 0 passive points and mitigated big hits about as well as a fully armored stacked character. His conclusion? Stack armor just isn't the move. Energy shield builds were doing the same job far more efficiently. Here's the part that actually matters for this video though. That was over a year and a half ago, and based on what I have found, it's still true today. Multiple current guides, some published within the last month, are still describing ES and evasion as dominating the endgame meta over armor, even after the buffs we just talked about. So GGG's data-driven fixes generally raise the floor. That's part's real. But the core imbalance Kaparian flagged on day one hasn't actually been solved. It's persisted through an entire year and a half of patches. And this is where the actual inconsistency comes in. Not just defenses being too low, but wildly uneven depending on what you're actually investing in. At the time of that Q&A, Jonathan directly called out the deflect formula as not good enough. Strong if you barely invested in it, but basically pointless to push further. Worth being fair here though, that one's actually a good example of them following through. The deflect formula got a real rework as part of 05 itself, and it's since become one of the strongest offensive layers in the game, so that specific inconsistency generally got fixed, not just talked about. Honestly, it's generally nice to see GGG actually put real changes in 05 all the way through the current patch 054. Instead of just talking about it, the buffs, the deflect, rework, that's real progress, but the core armor problem clearly still not fully cracked. So it'll be interesting to see how they keep chipping away at this one going forward. Now, here's one where GGG's honesty gets even more direct, the Leech issue. Jonathan said plainly, we are definitely unhappy with Leech. And here's the part I think is actually the most interesting. This isn't even GGG's first attempt at fixing it. They deliberately simplified Leech from how complicated it was in PoE1, and by their own admission, that simplification has not led to good results. So this is a system now on its second real design attempt, and they're already talking through a third. The actual fix they described did get implemented though, and it's still in the live system today, going into 05, 054. Leech moved to a single source per resource, life, mana, and energy shield, each only leech from their strongest active source at a time. And every leech instance got a hard cap, 40,000 damage cap per hit, counting toward the calculation, no matter how much higher your actual damage gets. All instant leech got removed entirely. That's a real specific engineering answer to a real specific problem. And it's held up as the live system through 054. Though, whether it's fully solved, the underlying complaint is still something the community is actively debating. This issue is less about an unresolved problem and more about a deliberate trade-off. And to be honest, this is generally a sensitive topic in the community, oh boy. So let's actually dig into it properly instead of just repeating GGG's talking points. What am I talking about, you're asking? It's why life isn't on the tree, oh boy. Jonathan's reasoning for keeping life off the passive tree comes down to avoiding what he called noob traps. Situations where if you don't already know you need to prioritize something, you just quietly suffer for it without realizing why. His stated preference is that if you're dying too much, the fix should come from itemization, gear upgrades, ruins, crafting, something you can act on immediately rather than a tree respec that might be 12 levels up away. Here's the part that actually makes this a sensitive topic though, and I think it's worth saying plainly. A huge chunk of the community's frustration is that while life sits off the tree, Energy Shield doesn't. And ES has been the dominant defensive layer this entire time. That's a real fair thing to be annoyed about. GGG's asking people to solve survivability through itemization on one hand, while the tree's other hand is stacked with ES scaling that does exactly what people wanted life to do. And here's the part that actually surprised me digging into this. ES did get hit with a real nerf in 05. Recovery specifically got cut somewhere between 50 and 66% across gear. The tree and ruins, that's not a small tweak. That's a serious cut. But guess what? ES is still considered one of the strongest defensive options in the current patch because that nerf only touched how fast your ES recovers, not how big your total pool can actually get. The scaling potential through gear, jewels, and tree investment barely moved. So the thing that made ES so dominant in the first place never actually went away. It just recharges a bit slower now. So here's the real irony. A lot of the same players asking for simple, no-brainer life on the tree are already deep into a system that's arguably way more complex, gear-dependent, and tree-hungry than life ever would have been. And it's just survived a real nerf without losing its throne. Whether that means GG's life philosophy is actually wrong or whether ES just needs another real look, I think it's a completely fair question. And honestly, I don't think it's fully settled yet either way. He was upfront that this isn't a close decision either. He directly said it's not off the table permanently. It's contingent on whether the itemization-based fixes actually solve the underlying problem well enough first. So this one's genuinely still up in the air. They're not just being stubborn about it. Well, okay, maybe just a little. All right, this is honestly the question underneath everything else in this video. How does GGG even know what's actually wrong in a game this complicated? And it's not just one trick. It's a few different things stacked together, in my humble opinion. First, they don't start from guessing. They start from real stats. Same thing we saw with the defensive problem earlier. They didn't nerf monsters or buff gear based on a feeling. They went and pulled actual player data across the whole player base and compared it against what they expected people to have at that point in the game. That's step one for basically everything. Check the real numbers before deciding anything's actually broken. Second, and this is the part I think people miss, when the numbers do look off, they don't just jump on the first explanation. Jonathan laid out multiple possible reasons for the exact same piece of data. Maybe players aren't upgrading gear as much as expected. Maybe they're skipping defensive passives. Maybe the formulas themselves are just bad. They actually have to sit there and figure out which of those it really is before touching anything, because fixing the wrong cause makes things worse, not better. Third, they've got to actively correct for their own bias, not just the players. This is where the boss timing thing actually fits. Not as the whole answer, just one piece of it. Even their own designers guessed wrong when asked how long an average boss fight takes, because everyone's mental picture gets wrapped up by watching streamers who are running builds nowhere close to what a real average player has. So part of their process is literally catching themselves making that same mistake and correcting for it with real data instead of trusting their gut. Fourth, it's not just internal number crunching either. They're pulling from actual player bug reports and feedback too, real submitted issues, not just spreadsheets. And on top of that, once something's live, they're leaning on the fact that the entire player base can stress test a system way faster than their internal team ever could alone. And last, none of this happens in a vacuum. They're actually keeping a running, prioritized list of known problems. Jonathan flat out referenced his own top 5, now grown into what he called a top 10. So it's not reactive chaos. It's a real, maintained list they're working through. This Leech thing, that defensive thing, in order, not just whatever loudest on social media that week. So when you put that all together, real data first, multiple explanations considered before committing, correcting for their own streamer warped perception, direct player reports as a second input, and a genuinely maintained priority list, that's the actual answer to how a studio this size keeps track of what's broken in a game this complex. Not guesswork, a real process. Okay, so that's 4 real issues GGG's actually worried about. But I don't want you just to leave with this information. I want you to actually walk away with something you can use next time you're playing this beautiful game. On defenses, if you felt like your build is squishy, even though you're playing it right, that's not just you. GGG's own data said the same thing, especially from around Act 4 through early endgame, which is exactly the stretch where a lot of you have told me you feel weakest. So don't just shrug it off as a skill issue. Specifically, given that Deflect got the real fix and ES builds are generally strong, if you're on the fence between leaning armor or leaning ES for a new character, in my humble opinion, ES is the safer bet. And go actually check your passive tree for defensive nodes you might have skipped while beelining it for damage nodes. Since Jonathan flat out said a lot of players aren't taking as many defensive passives as the game expects you to. On Leech, stop chasing the old infinite sustained fantasy. It's capped now. 40k damage per instance, one source at a time, and all instant leech got removed. That means stacking more raw hit damage past the cap does nothing extra for your recovery anymore. So if your build's currently built around one huge trigger hit keeping you alive, that's not working the way it used to. Instead, go actually look at your gear and jewels for flat leech percentage affixes specifically. That's the stat doing the real work now, not your damage number. Although, don't get me wrong, damage is very important. On life, stop waiting for it to show up on the tree or feeling like you're missing some hidden system. If you're dying too much, your first move should be upgrading your gear, looking at your jewels, looking at your passive tree, looking at your ruins. Specifically, look at the runic ward options that are available this league, since that's the exact itemization-based safety net GGG built to replace a life cluster on the tree. Check your crafting options too. Essences and ruins that add flat life or runic ward are generally meant to be your go-to fix here, not a last resort. And the biggest one, honestly, stop measuring your own runs against streamer clips. If a boss fight takes you 2 minutes instead of 8 seconds, or God forbid 2 seconds, that's not you playing badly. That's literally the average. By GGG's own admission, practically, that means don't panic and start swapping your whole build because one clip online made a fight look trivial. Your 2-minute fight is the normal experience, not a sign something's wrong with you or your character, aka lose the FOMO complex. And believe me, I personally have to take that advice. Who's kidding who? So that's 4 real admitted problems from grinding gear games, and 4 real things you can actually do differently because of them. Defense, leech, life, and honestly just trusting your own experience over what you see online. That's the real takeaway here, not just GGG has some issues, but here's how to actually play around where the game generally is right now, not where you assumed it was. And to be fair, this is a live service game. GGG will always be chasing issues, which means we're going to experience highs and lows. It's par for the course. Which of these issues are going to change how you're going to approach your next build or your next playthrough? Let me know. And like always, if there's something else going on in PoE2 you want me digging into, drop it below. I read every single comment. All right, everybody, that's it for today. If you're new here, hit subscribe, hit that like button too if you got something out of this. And don't forget to follow me on Twitch so you know when I will be streaming. Links are in the description. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really do appreciate it. Hope to see you on the next one. Take care. The opinions expressed in this video are mine and solely mine. Healthy debate is always encouraged. Hate is never welcomed. So get over it.